Hi, and thanks for joining us for the very last of the feedback loops that we are doing for St Vincent's Hospital's co-design of their safe haven. So today what we're going to be doing is we'll be sharing with you some of the feedback that we got in the last feedback loop, and we'll also be taking you through what people shared with us during our conversations that we had during the combined session. So that was and that combined session was a moment when we brought together people who have lived of suicide and health professionals from St Vincent's Hospital, and looked at some scenarios to explore how things might be done in the new safe haven. So I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Tina, so responsible for the support services for the suicide prevention peer workers. James?
Thank you. Thanks, Tina, and thanks for all your work to date and everyone else that's been involved. My name's James, and also one of the facilitators at Rose in the Ocean. And look forward to this end process too, given that it's, and Tina will share how much detail in terms of the longevity we've been working together in this process. So it's been awesome. So thanks for that, Tina.
Cool. So I'm just going to share my screen with you now. And we'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are all located on sacred land. So we're in case when we do things online like this. And we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all of the lands that we are located on. But in particular, we would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which this new safe haven is going to be established. So we would like to pay our respects to Gadigal elders, past and present, as well as to the young Gadigal people who will be the elders of the future. And acknowledge all of the people with lived experience who are contributing to this co-design process. So that includes people who have a lived experience of suicidal crisis, people who have survived a suicide attempt, people who have cared for someone who has been in suicidal crisis, and also people who have been bereaved through suicide. And we'd like to, in particular, acknowledge their contribution and the contribution of their expertise to this process. We'd also like to acknowledge that a lot of health professionals have their own lived experience that they've brought to this process. And that also health professionals have special expertise that they've gained through the work that they've done supporting people during suicidal crisis. So what we're doing today is we're presenting the final lot of information that we're putting out into the community from this co-design process. And the idea is that we're hoping that this webinar will be viewed by as many people as possible, and that after viewing the webinar, that people will use the link that we provide to go to a survey and then provide us as broad a perspective as possible. So the co-design process has involved specific participants, so a group of people with lived experience of suicide and a group of people who are health professionals linked to St Vincent's Hospital. And we would like to build on the input that we've had from those people who have directly contributed to this process. And watching this webinar, finding out about the perspectives that have already been presented in the co-design, and also getting that survey link and using that to provide us further input. That's how we gain the broadest perspective possible about how people would like to see this new safe haven operate. So the little diagram that you can see there, that's setting out the co-design process that we followed. So what we did was we first had what we call focus conversations. So very, very focused conversations with small groups of people with lived experience, and focused conversations with small groups of health professionals. Then we brought all of the people from those small groups together and brought all the people who have lived experience of suicide together to have more in-depth conversations about the safe haven. And then we also brought together all of the people who participated as health professionals in a larger group and had more in-depth conversations with them. We've already provided you information about what came out of those conversations in our first and second feedback loops. We've presented all of the feedback that we got from you to everybody who's participated in the process when we brought together people with lived experience and health professionals together in the same Zoom conference to have some really, really deep discussions about, I guess, some of the areas that needed further exploration in terms of how things would be managed in the safe haven. So what we're doing today is we're going to feed back to you all of that information that's come out of that process, all the perspectives that we've captured from those conversations. So I'm going to hand over to James now, who's going to tell you about the information that was provided to us in the second feedback loop.
Wonderful, thanks Tina. And as we'll say throughout this recorded webinar, albeit there's a couple of that join us, and thank you for those that could, it'd be great for you to at some stage as you're going through this, if you want to stop, pause and read the more finer detail of some of the feedback and particularly some of the scenario stuff we cover off on later on. So I'll give you an opportunity to really absorb that as well. So as we can see, and thanks Tina, as we can see the findings from feedback loop 2. So we had 3 responses from those with lived experience and 2 from the health professionals. So thank you for those that gave that feedback. In particular, respondents agreed that the content accurately reflected their input into the process so far, and additional perspectives either affirmed what has been captured previously or added, in fact, additional context or considerations for how the service will be established. So there's some good positivity there. Thank you. Tina, do you want to flick through that next slide and we can look at the feedback from the some samples of the lived experience perspectives. As I said, I won't go through them all, but if you want to stop them at some stage whilst you're watching this, you can have a look at them in more detail. I'll cover off on a couple. For me, the core experience that saved my life was the follow-up/aftercare. I would prefer a cafe-style environment that enables people to choose whether to sit in small or large groups. It can be good too, it can have art, music, etc. classes and not be formal as structured or therapy. And as you can see, a couple of the other ones there, and also documentation is important. We could ask the service users if they wouldn't mind us documenting what happened today. So some great feedback there. In fact, there's a little bit more, so I'll get Tina to flick through, please. Again, some further ones from the lived experience perspectives. It is a safe haven for suicide prevention. How do you differentiate someone in suicidal despair or crisis from someone just coming in as a place to go? How do you keep the purpose of suicide prevention and not a community centre? And a lot of conversation around that, which was some good feedback. For the model to be peer-led, it would be appropriate to have more than the 2 full-time equivalent staff. Otherwise, the service will not be open very often, or the staff may become burnt out. Bright colours in the interior design, I find that corny. The hotel is a beautiful space and I think should be calm and warm. So some great feedback there from individuals. As I said, if you want to pause it to have a look at some of the other ones, it would be awesome. So from some samples from the health professional perspective feedback. Due to geographical location, the Green Park as safe haven has the potential to become very busy due to the high volume of people who come to the area. I agree the workforce should be diverse, but disagree with the community selecting staff. So some good feedback here. We need more funding to make the space work effectively and appropriate staffing ratios and to be able to open longer hours. Staff can assist in arranging accommodation and the emphasis on assist. And one final one there, the peer workers shouldn't be given personal mobile numbers to the guests. Guests will be provided with a landline or email address. So some really good feedback there from both the health professionals and the lived experience group. Thanks, Tina.
Thanks, James. So what we're going to share with you now are the scenarios that we explored in the combined session. So these particular scenarios are designed to bring up situations where either there's been some kind of divergence of opinion in the conversations so far, or where they're really going to test, I guess, the boundaries of what people feel the safe haven can and can't do. So it's natural that these conversations brought out a range of perspectives, and there wasn't complete agreement. So we certainly want to hear from other people as well. So please use that link and share that link with other people for the survey that we will be opening today, because and you'll see as we present the feedback on these scenarios that definitely there needs to be some more conversation, and we're definitely interested to capture some other perspectives. So this is the first scenario that we explored with people who have lived experience of suicide and health professionals who are linked to St Vincent's Hospital. And it's about Chantel. And Chantel is a 17-year-old teenage girl who arrives at the safe haven experiencing suicidal thoughts. It's the first time she's ever reached out for help, and she is frightened. And it's 30 minutes before closing time. So the reason that we have a look at Chantel's scenario, sorry, I'm just trying to improve my internet reception. The reason that we look at Chantel's scenario is because we want to explore how people under the age of 18 will be supported when seeking help through the safe haven. But also we want to determine how the local safe haven will manage supporting guests within the organisational constraints. Okay, so in this situation, Chantel has turned up 30 minutes before closing time, and we want to explore how with the resources available in the safe haven, how they might be able to support Chantel. We also want to determine what the scope and nature of support is to guests beyond the direct support they get in the safe haven, because clearly, because Chantel has turned up 30 minutes before closing time, there's going to need to be some kind of explorations of other options for supporting Chantel at that time. So these are the ideas that came out of the conversation that we had with people who have lived experience of suicide and health professionals. So the first real theme that came out of those conversations was the need to build trust and support Chantel. So to recognise that Chantel is young, vulnerable, and that she's reaching out for help for the first time. It was commented that it's important for peer workers to connect with Chantel because this is an opportunity to avoid her having negative experiences. And we don't want her to have negative associations with reaching out for help. It was suggested that Chantel be offered a tangible support pack with information and details about other contacts. She needs to be offered a calm and quiet space so that she can settle in and become comfortable before having to talk with other people. It was also suggested that we need to determine how Chantel is presenting, and we need to understand her distress and to be upfront and transparent in setting expectations of closing times, and also being very clear about what can be offered within the half hour of time that's available. There were some more specific comments about how the safe haven can respond to guests who arrive close to closing time. So firstly, that there's a need to build rapport and safety with Chantel. And then after that's been done, to gauge the severity of her crisis and the risk of her acting on her suicidal thoughts. It was said that people who turn up right before closing time really, in principle, need to be supported, and the safe haven needs to avoid turning Chantel away without any support and then assuming that she'll come back the next day, because it was very, very clear in conversations that that's not something that people can assume. It was commented that there needs to be planning in collaboration with Chantel and also with the service manager to determine the most appropriate place for her to go after the safe haven closes. It was commented that there might be a poster on the door of the service with information about opening hours and also information about what people can do and where they can go if they're really distressed and it's outside those opening hours. Also, there needs to be consideration about when the ideal closing time for the safe haven is. So it was pointed out And there was a lot of conversation around the fact that people's distress tends to intensify in the evening, and that maybe 8 p.m. is not the ideal for the safe haven to be closing. In terms of what can be done for Chantel in terms of after she leaves, and also in terms of follow-up, there were some specific comments about that. There may be a need to connect Chantel with the emergency department if it's recognised that she's vulnerable and that she requires that for support. In terms of doing that, it was suggested that a peer worker could offer to walk with Chantel over to the emergency department, or that they could arrange for someone from the emergency department to come across to the safe haven. And other comments on this relationship with the emergency department included that the safe haven could make arrangements to transition across to the emergency department smoothly, so that there was no need for waiting in triage or for retelling of the story. After handover occurs, it was suggested that Chantel be told that the peer worker will follow up the next day, and then it's important that the peer worker actually does follow up with her. It was highlighted that there needs to be a process and there needs to be support and good relationships between the safe haven staff and the emergency department. And suggested that the safe haven could normalise the process of going to the emergency department when the service is closing. So one of the ideas for that was that it could actually be part of the safe haven's process that each night when they're closing, they take a walk over to the emergency department, and anybody who wants to come with them can come with them, and that would really normalise that experience for people. Also, it was commented that we need to ensure that Chantel can get home okay, or that she has access to natural supports or other services in the community. Now, this scenario obviously raised the issue of what happens when somebody is under the age of 18. And I'm going to share with you now some of the comments made about supporting someone of Chantel's age. So it was said that while Chantel's age is not an issue for the safe haven, St Vincent's Hospital is an adult hospital and it has limited treatment options for children. And that if she was connected with the emergency department, that whilst the emergency department could see her, they would have limited options available for her and that they could connect her to. So the safe haven could be a private space for young people, away from parents, where they can be supported to contact other organisations that specialise in speaking with young people, such as the Kids Helpline or Lifeline. And it was commented that, you know, Chantel might just need a private space where she can make that phone call away from her parents. Also, there's a need to acknowledge that use space, which is attached to St Vincent's Hospital, that does provide services for young people, but it's a private service and that people require private health insurance in order to access it. Relationships with other children's hospitals might need to be strengthened, and services in the community that can help young people. And it'll be important to support peer workers because we don't want to have to send Chantel to ED if it's not the best option for her. So they were the ideas that came out around Chantel's scenario. James, I'm going to hand over to you now so that you can take us through what people said about scenario 2.
Wonderful, thanks Tina. As we can see here, let's just quickly whip through what this scenario is about. So Leanne walks into the safe haven. She knows the safe haven well, having visited for a few weeks in a row. She had previously told that SP peer worker it is a place where she can relax for a while, knowing that she is safe from self-harming while she's there. Tonight, she appears to be intoxicated and is quite agitated that the peer worker who she now feels she can trust isn't available to talk with her. She's becoming quite loud and insistent, and another guest has indicated that is making them uncomfortable. So let's have a look at the purpose of scenario 2. Thanks, Tina. And this is, again, trying to determine what were some of the challenges around this. So determine how the safe haven will work with guests who appear to be intoxicated. to determine the local safe haven and how it will work with guests whose distress may express itself as aggression, and also to explore ways that peer workers will manage the competing needs of our guests. So the responses that came through from the groups that we work with were under a couple of topics. One was around the idea of how do we manage the safety of guests and staff within the safe haven, recognising the acknowledgement of people that will come to the safe haven intoxicated and showing aggression. So managing the safety of all in the safe haven will be a challenging aspect. It's behaviour rather than the intoxication that determines whether someone is suited to attend or visit the safe haven. Making sure there's procedures in place to ensure guests and staff safety with management plans to respond to an incident if it occurs. And if other guests are feeling unsafe, they need a way to be able to express that and feel safe to tell a staff member or peer. Private rooms may be available to create a separate environment for Leanne to de-escalate and let her express what she needs to away from the other guests. So under the kind of theme of staff training, we looked at things like staff need to be adequate in their training and best way to respond to aggressive behaviour, including the role of de-escalation. Training is reinforced through clear expectation and processes of peer workers to have training around boundaries and are able to communicate them and are able to recognise when it's not safe and escalation may be or is required. The idea of a clear flow chart for staff of process for dealing with aggressive or intoxicated people was an idea. And finally, the use scenario-based training for staff to learn response strategies. Thanks, Tina. So under the idea or the concept of supporting Leanne, so it was important that staff understand different behaviours and why people exhibit them. It's important to acknowledge the range of responses, including anger, that the valid ways of expressing sadness, frustration, fear, etc., and that substance use is often a form of pain relief. Acknowledge that there are many valid ways to express sadness and fear, including anger. Staff having rapport with Leanne will help to talk with her if she's intoxicated. Safe haven should attempt to find ways to support Leanne, not just automatically turning people away. Leanne could be asked to go for a walk and come back. A peer worker might walk with her. And important to make Leanne feel as though she is in a safe space, even if it's not the right time. She could come back when she sobers up. So finally, under one of the last themes of scenario 2 was the connection to other supports, and only call others such as security, police or ambulance as a last resort, as is likely traumatising for Leanne and the other guests in the safe haven. And or maybe the idea of safety buttons available for staff for when security is needed. Nothing that calling security is a last resort and rarely used. Scenario 3.
So this is what we're going to have a look at now is the third scenario that we explored with people who have a lived experience of suicide and health professionals connected to St Vincent's Hospital. So this scenario is about Jason, who arrives at the safe haven with a lady of similar age who he doesn't introduce. Jason appears a little agitated with the woman, but seems happy to have arrived at the safe space. He accepts a cup of tea from one of the staff, and while he's chatting quietly with them, he keeps glancing towards the woman. It's discovered that she is Jason's sister and is really keen to stay with him in the safe haven and is clearly very concerned about her brother. So there's a reason that we have a look at this scenario. And the first is to determine the safe haven's approach to supporting carers and natural supports of people in crisis. So this is a topic that has actually come up quite a bit during the conversations throughout the co-design process. It's a topic that has brought out some very different perspectives amongst people who have lived experience. And so we really wanted to explore and see if we could arrive at some consensus about how someone in this situation might be responded to. So again, really encourage other people to get involved and let us know what you think and how you would like to see things working in the safe haven. You can do that by using the link that we've got at the end of this webinar to access our survey. So in terms of the scenario with Jason, part of the purpose is to determine how to identify and honour the wishes of the guest regarding the role of their carers and their natural supports in crisis. Because what we appear to have here is a situation where Jason's sister is very eager to be involved and very concerned, but Jason appears to be not so comfortable with his sister being there. We're also looking at how we can determine what other potential supports might be offered to carers and natural supports of people who visit the safe haven. So the conversations that we had about this scenario brought out a few different opinions. In terms of supporting Jason, it was suggested that we acknowledge that some people aren't comfortable with or don't want their carer there. And so that means that people's choices need to be respected. That Jason should be the one to make the decision about how his sister is involved in his support and to discuss with Jason what his concerns are and what his wishes are. It was suggested that the peer workers try to de-escalate Jason's concerns and maybe find a middle ground. Also to take into consideration that when in a psychotic state, some people might not be able to think clearly and communicate their needs. So that was a specific perspective that was provided during our group discussions. It was also suggested that they have a separate private space available for Jason to access if he wants to talk privately where his sister can't hear what he's saying. And acknowledge that some people may not be comfortable to speak about their suicidal ideation when they're in the presence of a family member. Overall, a big thing that came out was to maintain Jason's confidentiality in line with his wishes. He may wish to open up about what's brought him to the safe haven without his sister being involved in the conversation. So there were also a number of comments made around how Jason's sister can be acknowledged and acknowledged for what she's doing for Jason and also supported. So it was suggested that we recognise the role of Jason's sister and let them know they've done the right thing in bringing Jason to the safe haven. Also to acknowledge that carers can be a valuable source of insight into their loved one. And upon leaving, family support is going to play an important role for people. It was suggested that the safe haven could, that the safe haven could offer to take Jason's sister into a different space for a separate conversation so that they can understand what's happening from her perspective. But overall, there was a real recognition of the need to provide Jason's sister with information, with reassurance and with strategies that can assist her in supporting Jason, but also address her fears. In particular, in terms of supports for Jason's sister, there were two key suggestions. One was that they connect Jason's sister with support groups in the community where they can engage with other carers and obtain relevant information. Another comment that was made was that it could be challenging to respond to both Jason and his sister with only 2 full-time equivalent peer workers. So maybe there's a need to link Jason's sister in with other relevant supports where possible. So James, I'm going to hand over to you now to take us through the conversations about scenario 4.
Thank you. Let's read this. Thanks, Tina. David turns up the safe haven for the first time. He seems quite agitated and distracted. He had heard about the safe haven from a community services worker who supports him in a program for people with complex and enduring mental illness. He tells the SP's peer worker that his neighbour is trying to control his thoughts through a chip he has planted in his television. David says he can't handle the torment of this anymore and feels that killing himself is the only way to get relief from it. So let's have a look at some of the responding to scenario. We didn't get a purpose there. That's okay. What happened to our purpose? Oh, there we go. So the purpose of scenario 4, as we can see, is to determine the safe haven, how it approaches the support of guests who have been identified as having a serious mental illness, and how the safe haven supports guests who identify experience suicidal distress as a direct result of what clinicians would understand as symptoms associated with psychosis. And finally, the purpose of scenario 4 was to determine what non-clinical support looks like in the context of supporting guests with a diagnosis of serious mental illness. So the responses that we got, again, a theme of supporting David. So we can see here differing views held around whether the safe haven can or can't support David in this scenario, and a bit of conversation around that. The idea of talk to David about how he's feeling and his thoughts. Recognise that David has reached out for support. Build some form of rapport and try to understand what is going on for David. Acknowledge that this is David's reality and his feelings of distress and being unsafe are valid. Focus on just talking to David and calming him down where we could. Don't need to agree with his thoughts, but can provide understanding, support, and just someone to listen. Safe haven can be this holding space in the meantime to support him while connecting with the support he needs, and ensure that he feels safe, offer him maybe a cup of tea and a chat. But I will absolutely create a safety plan where David will, with what he can do to feel that he's throw those thoughts again. So under the theme of connection to other supports, the idea of recognition that these scenarios at the safe haven won't be able to respond to, such as what is driving David's distress in this scenario, which may require a clinical intervention. If David is serious risk of hurting himself, pardon me, if he was to return home, he should be referred to a more specialised service for support and help. If after some time being in the safe haven, David is still feeling the same way, connection to the emergency department may become appropriate. Some see the role of safe haven as a holding pattern in connecting David to more appropriate supports. And finally, they recognise that the referral to ED may result in David receiving involuntary treatment. Concern this could create a perception that the safe haven is not a safe and trusted place to go when you're in that scenario. Under the theme of staff training and supports, the idea of procedures are in place to support the peer workers to determine the risks of this situation. Concern of peer workers feeling the need to do an assessment of David, despite the safe haven being a non-clinical service. Some level of clear definition needed around the scope of the peer support worker role. The manager could be utilised to make decisions about referral, calling the ambulance linked to existing clinical supports that David may or has in place. And continue to check in on David to see how he's going. Whether he can be in the safe haven depends on how he's behaving and whether he's having an impact on the other guests. Thanks, Tina.
So David's scenario actually did bring out a real range of views as to what the purpose of the safe haven is, and I guess where the limits are to what the safe haven can do. So we had a range of views there from people who felt that actually David couldn't be helped by the safe haven and needed to be referred on to ED, all the way to other people who felt that there really was something that the peer workers could do in listening to David and supporting David. So we do really encourage you, please let us know what you think and what you feel the role is of the safe haven in supporting a person like David who might be described as experiencing psychosis. We're very interested in hearing your point of view on that. So this is the last scenario that we had a look at. And this is about Amanda. So Amanda's a 20-year-old woman. She has a history of past suicide attempts, and she comes into the safe haven extremely distressed. She says that her life is not worth living, that she's tried everything to stop feeling this way. She tells the suicide prevention peer worker that she has been on dozens of different medications, tried therapy for childhood trauma, done everything the psychologist told her, Nothing ever works, and she has run out of options. When the worker asks her if she has plans to kill herself, she tells them that she has the means and is just waiting for her mum and dad to leave her alone. Her history of previous attempts is known by one of the Safe Haven peer workers who's previously supported her in the emergency department. So the reason we look at Amanda's scenario is firstly to determine how the local safe haven will respond to guests who are characterised as at imminent risk of suicide. Also to determine how the suicide prevention peer workers will support guests who are highly suicidal to support their safety. And finally, to look at what the suicide prevention peer workers will need in order to support guests who are highly suicidal in an effective way. So one of the big themes that came out of our conversation about Amanda was how non-clinical support could be provided to someone in Amanda's situation. So some of the ideas included to provide support to Amanda by offering to have a chat and attempting to calm her down. Also to acknowledge that she's done the right thing by walking in and that there is hope. It was suggested that the peer workers could devise an action plan and obtain her commitment, and also to acknowledge her pain through connection with a peer worker so that she knows someone who understands her, understands what it's like to be in suicidal crisis, and also someone who's able to share their own experiences. The peer worker may be able to reframe what was reframe going to the emergency department. And what was meant by that is that by speaking with Amanda about possibly going to the emergency department, the peer worker may be able to help Amanda see that as a suitable option for her if that's what's required. It was suggested that the safe haven can restore hope for Amanda and trust that she will be supported. And also another comment that it's not a peer worker's role to complete assessments. And so there was a little bit of discussion around the peer worker being involved in this non-clinical support rather than actually assessing Amanda. Some specific comments were made about prioritising Amanda's safety. It was commented that while being held in the safe haven, priority should be to minimise her distress by sitting with her, supporting her, and building rapport with her. That within the safe haven, there could be a safer space, so somewhere a little bit more tranquil for people who are feeling quite distressed. And also that Amanda should be asked if there's anything that works well for her, or also whether she's willing to try other options. So Amanda definitely feels like nothing works. So maybe that can be explored, and peer workers could help see if there are things that she hasn't tried before. Some suggestions were breathing exercises, mindfulness, or distraction activities. And a lot of these strategies were very focused on addressing Amanda's immediate level of distress. There were a few comments around the fact that it's going to be difficult to have meaningful conversations with Amanda until that distress is addressed. It was suggested that there should be planning for where Amanda will go next after she leaves the safe haven. There should be follow-up the next day. Also contact with other supports for Amanda. So her family is mentioned in the scenario, and plans on how to keep Amanda safe. Amanda should be provided practical supports. In particular, she should be given phone numbers she can call at times that the safe haven isn't open. And the peer workers may benefit from debriefing after each shift, especially when things are quite serious. So the idea was that they could debrief with their manager. They could also debrief with each other. The last real theme that came out of the conversation about Amanda was about connection to other services. So it was acknowledged that a clinical intervention may be required to keep Amanda safe in this situation, that Amanda is vulnerable, at very high risk, she has a plan and means, and so it might not actually be safe for her to leave the safe haven and return home. It was also commented that Amanda may be better supported somewhere safe where there's 24-hour support, and that she could come back to the safe haven at a later date. There was some discussion around the idea of holding Amanda in the safe haven until there's a time that she can, that arrangements can be made for her to be connected to the emergency department. But once she has an admission, she can be connected to other services for people who have either survived a suicide attempt or experienced crisis. Some of those that were mentioned included the Wayback Support Service, or also being connected with a social worker who could come to the emergency department. It was noted that the safe haven needs to have strong relationships with the emergency department and also with the Wayback Support Service. It was also acknowledged that a lot of people come through who don't necessarily need the emergency department. And it was commented that there are risks involved in sending people to the emergency department every time that they're deemed to be thinking about suicide. So there was some difference of opinion here that we'd be interested in hearing your view on. Also, it was questioned whether there should be someone else at the safe haven other than peer workers to make decisions about people like Amanda, and to transfer people like Amanda to the emergency department. So when we got to the end of these scenarios, because they brought out some of the key issues that had sort of risen out of the conversations we'd had so far, we then took that opportunity to ask everyone who was present what their non-negotiables were for the safe haven. And on reflection on those scenarios and all the conversations we've had, these are the non-negotiables that people suggested. So the first one is that the safe haven does what it says. The second one, respecting the heritage of the building and the importance of it. The third non-negotiable was mutual respect for all users of the safe space and all staff at all times. The fourth non-negotiable that was suggested was that the safe haven should be open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The fifth non-negotiable that was suggested, that it not just be another waiting room where people wait for hours to be seen. Another non-negotiable was that it shouldn't become too clinical, that it's a safe space because the staff are trained well enough to make those judgments. Another non-negotiable was that anyone can go in there and that anyone feels safe. Also, that we involve the person's carer in whatever way they see best. And finally, that everyone's experience is viewed as valid and able to be heard, and that no crisis is more valid than the other. So that brings us to the end of all of the ideas that we were able to collect during the co-design process. And we really do thank everybody who was involved in those conversations for bringing their ideas, for bringing their perspective and bringing their expertise to the conversation. We're now going to have a look at what happens after this. So thank you for watching this webinar. Please send a link for this webinar to other people, including people who are connected to St Vincent's Hospital who have a lived experience of suicide, but also health professionals who are connected to St Vincent's Hospital. And we also encourage you to share the link for the webinar with other workers in services that are local, that are in that same area as St Vincent's Hospital, and that often are supporting the same people. So once people have sort of watched this webinar, you will see that there's a link to a survey. I believe that's on the website for Roses in the Ocean. So that survey, it says there that it's going to close on the 29th of June, but we've actually just found out that we're able to keep that survey open until the 18th of July. So that gives you a lot of time to really share the link for the survey with other people, encourage them to watch this webinar, to hear what's come out of the conversation so far, and to let us know what their point of view is. So there'll be a final collection of information from that. Beacon Strategies, who's involved with collecting and collating and finding themes in the information that is shared with us by the participants. What they do is they create a report, and that report is given to St Vincent's Hospital so that they can use the ideas that have come out of this co-design process and implement them with the new safe haven. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. All right. So again, thank you. If you are watching this webinar live, you're welcome to ask any questions that you have. So
can I just clarify, Tina, and thank you, that just the dates on that final slide were in a little bit of a time warp.
Yeah.
Today's the 30th of June, unless you're overseas. And very well put in terms of the feedback survey closes on the 18th of July. So we've got a bit of extra time there. So thanks for that.
Yeah. So I don't think we have any questions, but this is our final feedback loop webinar. So it's been fantastic to be involved in this process. It's always great to see co-design processes bringing out really unique local needs and also really reflecting the values of the people in the local area. And that's definitely something that's happened. And definitely looking forward as well to hearing how the new safe haven is going. Looking forward to it being opened, and really looking forward to seeing all of the ideas that have come out of this process being brought into reality in that new safe haven. James, anything from you?
Well done, Tina, and just to reiterate what you said before, thank you to the passion and commitment for all those that have been involved in this process over the last 12 weeks, obviously including yourself, but the insight, the wisdom and the knowledge that come from those that have a lived experience, and also the health professionals, to really co-design something that's going to work for the community is going to be awesome. And like you, looking forward to watching it up and running. Well done.
Cool. All right. In that case, I might say goodbye.
Wonderful. Just a farewell, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thanks, Tina.